Well, it's that time of year again, and by that time of year I mean it's the stealth game time of year. I mean, it really isn't, but I always find myself playing stealth games around the turn of the new year. Maybe it's the shell shock from the holiday season that makes me want to hide away from any form of social interaction, which makes stealth games so appealing, but regardless, this year round I figured I'd play one that I haven't ever played before, and that game was Intravenous. Intravenous, whatever. It's one of those games that I picked up ages ago when it first came out, and I played an hour of it, got bored, and dropped it to do something else. But since my New Year's resolution was to clear out my gaming backlog, I figured it was finally time to give this game a crack. Anyways, the game was released a couple years back and is the brainchild of basically one guy. That guy being Roman spy 𝘸𝘢𝘴𝘩𝘦𝘴. And if the nickname Spy rings a bell, then that's because before he worked on Intravenous, he made Gary's Mod add-ons under the same Steam handle. Those add-ons being the very influential customizable weaponry 2.0 packs, which is now Chuck's weaponry for some reason. These packs are the whole reason I even learned about this game's existence. As someone who's played a pretty substantial amount of Gmod, I was already pretty familiar with these add-ons, and out of curiosity, I checked out the developer's Steam page to see what else he was up to. And to my surprise, he was developing his own game. I clicked the link, saw the game, and found it intriguing enough, and I decided to wishlist it. A few months go by and the game releases, so I bought it, and I didn't really like it. In fact, I kind of hated it. I hated it to the point of never even wanting to play it ever again. For fuck's sake, I put it in my hidden games on Steam for the longest time. But it's been a couple years since then, and now that I have a YouTube channel, I figured it was time to finally give this game a spin to see if my hunch was right. In the game, you take control of a guy named Steve. We find Steve and his brother Charles enjoying a night out on the town, doing such brotherly activities as hitting up the local shooting range, getting some drinks, and talking to girls. The usual alpha male activities, but that's besides the point. After an eventful night out, though, Steve and Charles head home and end up wandering through the seedy part of town. The two are cornered by a bunch of crackheads in an abandoned apartment complex, and the two are held at what looks like Broken Bottle Point and robbed. Of course, they don't take this sitting down, but since the two are outnumbered, Steve is knocked out and Charles is unintentionally gravely injured by one of the druggies. After they realize that Charles is probably going to die, they scatter and leave us for dead. Charles is rushed to the ICU, but that night he sadly passes away. A month flies by at this point, and the police search for the addicts that killed your brother stagnates, and realizing that the police have likely given up on the case, Steve puts on the mask, grabs the gun, and heads out to take things into his own hands. After revisiting the site of the murder, he ends up leaving empty-handed. Angry, sad, and disappointed, he heads back to his place only to be contacted by a strange man over the phone. The man says that he too has been burned in the past by the same men that killed our brother. He offers to help us by supplying us with just about anything we'll need in our crusade. Weapons, training, and info on our attackers. And feeling that he has no other option to avenge his brother, Steve accepts the offer and the game can truly begin. Anyways, let's move on to the game part of this game. If I told you that this game kinda looks and plays like Thief and Hotline Miami had a baby, you'd probably think I'm crazy. And I am crazy, because it's actually more Splinter Cell than Thief. I'm just gonna use Thief as an example throughout this video because it's probably one of the best stealth games ever made. Obviously, the thing that links it to Hotline Miami the most is its top-down camera perspective. This seems cool on paper, but it makes the game kind of hard to play. I'll talk about that in a bit, though. But besides the camera, the game's art style is almost like an anti-Hotline Miami. Instead of the game being set in a Miami Vice hellscape void, it tries its best to be as down-to-earth and grounded as possible. This aesthetic is reflected in the levels: abandoned warehouses, apartment complexes, seedy drug dens, etc. In the second half of the game, the levels transition from crumbling ruins to lavish mansions and clubs. In more of a technical sense, though, the levels still look pretty good. The sprite work is excellent, even if the selection of sprites is kinda lacking. I mean, you fight the same bald and red-headed goons for basically the entire game. The weapons don't fare much better. Sure, they look pretty interesting on the weapon selection screen. In-game, almost every weapon uses the same sprites. Very few weapons in the game have their own unique sprites to go along with them. But considering the size of the development team, if you can even call it a team to begin with, I think the small pool of sprites is perfectly understandable. In terms of lighting, the game does fine. It's no Thief 2, but it's still pretty damn good. At the very least, it's usually pretty obvious what is and isn't dark enough to conceal the player. And really, that's all you can ask for in a game like this. In terms of sound design and music, the game is also just, acceptable. There's nothing too outstanding, just some pretty standard urban ambience, which is always masked by the pretty standard techno soundtrack. Each track for almost every level in the game is split into 2 or 3 different parts: stealth, suspense, and assault. I don't know if these are the actual names of the phases, I don't think there are any, but that's what I'm going to be naming them. I can't remember hating or particularly loving any of these tracks, but for what they are, they work fine, so I'll cut it a little slack. One thing that I can give it a little bit of slack are the weapon sounds. I'm sorry, but these are just kinda weak. They sound decent, but when you pick up a gun like a Desert Eagle or a sawed-off shotgun, you'd expect it to have a loud, booming report. While it does kind of sorta hit that mark, the sound lacks any reverb to make the impacts feel punching or meaningful in any way. And lastly, one thing that you may have already noticed is that this game completely lacks any kind of voice acting. which, while understandable considering this game's development and developer, is still kind of a questionable choice, especially considering how conversation heavy this game can be at times. Oh, and when I said no voice acting, I meant literally none. Not a single soul even utters a "What was that noise?" Besides that, most of this game's story hinges on the many conversations that Steve has with many of the criminal underworld's denizens. And with no voice acting, it's kinda hard to determine a proper tone with some of these. Sometimes it seems like a crime drama, other times it seems like a comedy. And it flip-flops between that pretty regularly. Still, I suppose that the writing is a topic for later on. Anyways, let's just get on with the real meat and potatoes of this game. Before you even start the game lets you customize pretty much every aspect of the game's difficulty right off the bat. Not only does it let you change things like the amount of saves per level or the actual enemy detection radius, but on top of that you can add on several mutators that change the entire way the game is played. These range from small things like adding a Desert Eagle to everyone's inventory, or changing the entire game to feature a currency system that wasn't in the base game. Since the actual gameplay is so dense, I think I'm just going to start with something relatively simple, like the movement system. Right off the bat, your character doesn't move around in the normal WASD fashion. Instead, the camera follows wherever Steve's head is looking. If Steve is looking up, W moves forward and S moves back, and vice versa if he's looking the opposite direction. I know this isn't the first game to feature this system, but the only one that I can remember ever playing with a similar system is 𝘸𝘢𝘴𝘩𝘦. And oh, side note, 𝘸𝘸𝘴𝘩𝘦 is absolutely awesome, you should go and play that game, it's totally sick. Regardless, one thing that I can safely say is probably entirely unique to Intravenous is how it tackles movement speed. Instead of there being a couple of fixed states, like walking, sprinting, crouch walking, and so on and so forth, the game features a surprisingly diverse spectrum of movement speeds. Instead of just holding shift to sprint, you can use the scroll wheel to precisely alter how fast your character is moving, ranging from a very slow walk to a pretty fast sprint. This is actually a really cool system that I honestly wouldn't mind seeing in other games. Since the game puts so much emphasis on staying quiet and stealthy, you can use the slider to pick the exact perfect movement speed for any occasion. Still, if you don't like player freedom or good game design or something like that, you can just keep the slider at 2 or 3 and then just hold shift, which basically acts like a sprint button in any other game. In addition to the movement slider, you can go prone to avoid further detection, although you can't use your weapons or sprint, and you can climb or vault over certain walls. Okay, all this is good and all, but let's move on to something more substantial, like for instance, the stealth. Stealth in this game is pretty standard, all things considered. Besides the unique movement system, the game follows a pretty standard stealth code. I mean, the code isn't really a code, they're more like guidelines really. Still, all of the basic stealth game principles remain. Stay out of the light, hide your bodies in dumpsters or in dark, low traffic areas. Enemies in this game can actually hear bodies falling, so keep that in mind. They can also hear suppressed gunshots through walls, which can be annoying, but the enemy AI is a topic for later on. You can knock out power in certain sections by picking the locks on breaker boxes. You can pick the locks on doors too, or hell, you can even shoot them off if you so choose, although doing that is extremely loud, so don't do that in stealth. Honestly, with all of these mechanics, it almost feels like more of an immersive sim at times. And of course, if you do have to kill someone, make it fast, hide the body, and try to keep it quiet. And believe me, by the end of this game, you'll really have to be comfortable with killing people. Because sometimes the game can just be pretty masochistic with its enemy placement. In fact, sometimes you might just have to kill a lot of people actually. And with that being said, let's move on to the other main approach in this game, the combat. I know I said that the game kind of resembles a mutilated reverse Hotline Miami in the visual section, and the game definitely plays like that too. Rather than the high-octane quick deaths and instant retries of Hotline Miami, here the game intentionally makes combat as unappealing of a prospect as possible. While the enemies do often outnumber you 50-1, to tip the scales in your favor, you have an absurdly large toolkit to pull from. Not only do you have the weapons and the gadgets that you start with, but you can also use levels to your advantage. You can still use things like breaker boxes as distractions to split enemies apart for easy pickings. The enemies themselves don't necessarily take a ton of punishment before they go down, but you certainly can't either. Even when you're kitted out in body armor and at full health, you'll often only be able to catch a few stray bullets before you go down. Although this does vary on the caliber of the weapon that you're being shot at with. And on the topic of guns, this game gives the player a very diverse selection of tools. While every good stealth game has at least one weapon, it's usually saved as a last resort. When stealth has gone off the rails and you just absolutely have to kill someone, like the sword in Thief. Garrett's a damn fine thief, but he's no swashbuckler. So, Garrett only gets one sword. In contrast, Steve gets access to like 20 different swords. And bombs. You have an absurdly large arsenal of firearms to work with. Even by default, the game gives you access to a solid library of firearms to work with. Plenty of handguns, assault rifles, submachine guns, and a couple of shotguns. Most of them are pretty reliable, with the only exception being the shotgun, sadly. Except for the really overpowered semi-automatic 𝘐𝘥𝘪. That thing is just fucking insane. There's also a bunch of unique weapons dotted across the levels, which are special guns that can be picked up and used in said levels as long as you extract with the gun in your inventory. Still though, when you play the game like a stealth game, you'll never really need more than a silenced pistol and maybe one or two situational gadgets, like a throwing knife. But when you plan for combat, you'll probably go in rocking an AR, a pistol, some grenades, a claymore, or maybe even some body armor too. I mean, you miss out on a ton of the game's firearms when you decide to go ghosting, since the game also punishes you for bringing in extra equipment by making you move slower and louder too, so planning for everything really isn't an option. It's not like it's gonna matter though, since you're probably gonna be sticking to one approach for most of the game. But if you do decide to play in stealth, I can't say you're going to be playing for the entire game because it just becomes not fun to play in stealth past like level 4. And with that being said, I think it's now time to talk about some of the less savory aspects of the game. Let's start with the least offensive of these, the camera. You see, when you happen to be walking down a hallway in any other stealth game, you'll probably be able to see way down the hallway to the other end, which makes identifying threats much easier. But in Intravenous, you don't have such luxuries, since you have a top-down camera. So by the time that you see a threat, it's probably already too late. Since, in good lighting conditions, if an enemy is on screen and has line of sight of you, they've probably already seen you. Now, this on its own wouldn't be too bad, you know, you'd think there wouldn't be that many giant hallways in this game, but let me tell you, the level of design in this game it's bad. Like, really, really bad sometimes. To the point where the later stages of the game can become genuinely aggravating because of it. Let me explain. You see, the first few maps are fine, pretty good even. They do a decent enough job of giving the player plenty of different routes through each map. But by level 3 or 4, the game changes. Now, the game just becomes nauseatingly linear at times. The best showcase of this is level 4, the abandoned warehouses. The game starts you off in a pretty typical crate maze, which I'm convinced can only be effectively ghosted in one fucking way. The rest of the level doesn't exactly fare much better. While levels before this could have been at least semi-linear to an extent, you still had a couple of routes that could be used. But now, the game might as well be forcing you down a straight fucking line. Or a very curvy line, since despite the fact that the game only has one route that it's letting you take, you'll still have to run all over God's green earth to find the guy that you need to. This is because of the fact that this level has these randomly placed piles of crates and shipping containers that just happen to block off routes that take you where you need to go. I'm just assuming that the developer did this because of the fact that playtesters are able to beat this level in like 5 minutes by running all the way to the end and just finding the guy immediately. Despite the fact that this game is so linear at times, the game also has the miraculously ability to be simultaneously aimless too. In most maps, the game will drop you off next to your car near one of the corners of the map, and it'll just leave the rest to you to figure out. This wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing. I mean, hell, I don't mind a game that just lets the player carve their own path through level. A game that comes to mind is the first Deus Ex game, which drops you in a level with a list of objectives and expects you to figure out the best way to complete all of them. But I feel like it worked there because the levels are, for the most part, truly open-ended, and they also make sense. There's almost always multiple ways of completing the same objective, and while yes, in the end, the story is always the same, the journey to get there can be wildly different from playthrough to playthrough. In Intravenous, though, you're dropped off in one random spot, and you're expected to find the one optimal path through these labyrinthine maps that somehow manage to feature a load of dead space while simultaneously being exhaustively linear at the same time. I'm not saying you have to be as good as Deus Ex, but you could at least give us something. I mean, the game does try to pad out its more dull areas by hiding caches of useful items, like healing items, guns, ammo, and whatnot. The game can also grant you extra save files for reaching certain milestones in each level, whether that be getting to the halfway point or finding a secret area of some kind. But even still, these really aren't all that useful. All of the guns in this game can down an enemy in just a quick burst or even a single shot, so unless you're having an extremely hard time aiming, you'll likely never need any of these ammo caches. Enemies also drop their weapons on death, so even if you need ammo, you'll usually be able to scavenge what you need off of the cadavers you've created. The healing items are at least somewhat useful in specific circumstances. Still though, even one guy can easily knock your health down halfway, so 10 HP really isn't going to do a whole lot. And even then, your health will regenerate to a certain point, which kind of defeats the purpose of these healing items. The only one of these that's genuinely helpful is the extra saves, because having more save slots is always a nice thing. So the shoddy map design, combined with a somewhat annoying camera perspective, can make this game just kind of aggravating to play. Lastly though, we have something that's more of just a nitpick on my part, the enemy AI. Unlike in most stealth games, the enemies here show some semblance of having a frontal cortex because they are far smarter than the average stealth game enemy. They'll still do the usual stuff, find dead bodies, get alerted by gunfire or loud noises, but the list of things that can alert them I found is at least decently larger than other games. For example, if they see an open door that they don't remember being open, they'll have a dementia-ridden breakdown and believe that there's someone snooping around on the property. Not only will he do that, but he'll also go and tell his friends, and that basically makes that part of the map a no-go zone, and you know what, I think you can see where this is going. You have to be exhaustively deliberate with your actions, including closing every door that you come through, which is a little annoying to say the least. At least if you hit an enemy with a door, you can knock them out, which is pretty funny. Anyways, I think that about covers it with the gameplay. I'd say generally it's leaning towards the good side, but man, when it gets bad, it can just be damn, it can be rough. Anyways, I suppose that now would be a good time to check out the story and the rest of the levels in this game, because they're kind of intertwined. Okay, so where were we? Oh yeah, that's right. After Steve's fruitless adventure in the abandoned slums, he gets contacted by a mysterious accomplice who offers to help him with all of his firearms and trading needs in exchange for dealing with the drug dealers who iced our brother. Obviously, Steve takes the deal, and sometime later he's whisked away to an unknown safe house where his actual base of operations is for the rest of the game. After a short movement and stealth tutorial, the accomplice gives us a rundown on their battle plan for the coming months. After scrubbing through probably thousands of hours of CCTV footage, the accomplice managed to find a place that one of the thugs who beat us up seems to frequent. Instead of giving Steve the go-ahead to just go and whack the guy, the accomplice encourages Steve to lay low and train for a while. These guys aren't exactly going to be going anywhere anytime soon. So, Steve begrudgingly decides to take some time to train, and after a little over a month, Steve finally heads over to the slums to get down to business. In terms of levels, this one is fine. This is still before the levels become too linear, so stealthing through it blind is actually a decent enough option. I mean, I still fucked up a few times, but I was able to manage. Most of this mission, though, is just aimlessly running around looking for this guy's office, so I'll just skip to the part that actually matters. Once we arrive at his office, we can confront one of the goons that jumped us. He doesn't know what happened to the other guy, but he does know where said guy's dealer might be. Still, Steve, in his ultimate edgelordness, decides to whack the goon, and after that all we have to do is sneak our way back out to the car and escape. Once we're back at the safe house, the accomplice manages to find the place that our little friend was talking about. That place being an old abandoned apartment complex. This is easily one of my favorite levels in the game. I feel like at the very least it's a little less linear than the other maps, since the map is just so open and spacious, which does make it at least a little bit easier to stealth on a first time playthrough. Still, the place is crawling with goons, so we'll have to tread lightly. Once we approach what appears to be a large abandoned convenience store, the accomplice notifies us that our guy will likely be in there, and we're told to head inside. This is probably the worst part of this mission, at least if you decide to play it in stealth. There's only one solid path through this part, and it's pretty much down to trial and error to find it. Still, once we reach our target's office, we can find out that it's not the goon we're looking for. Instead, his drug dealer is here, so we decide to interrogate him instead. He doesn't know where our real target is, but he can tell us who supplies him with the drugs he sells. Apparently, the bigwig drug distributor in the city goes by the moniker of the shopkeeper. He doesn't tell us anything else, but regardless, we kill him and we can properly extract after that. After we return to the safe house, the accomplice tells us that he's ruled out some spots that our brother's murderer may be hiding in. He's whittled down the options to an abandoned port warehouse. He says that since the guy is super paranoid, obviously since we've killed a bunch of his friends at this point, going in from the land won't be an option. He instead claims that going in from the water would be a better option, so he offers to provide us with some scuba gear. So with that bit of setup taken care of, we can finally begin to head in. At this point, the story finally begins to pick up, and even though I think the story in this game is kinda sorta bad, I'll let you skip ahead to the timestamp here if you don't want any spoilers. You really want to see this, don't you? Oh, well, can't say I didn't warn you. Level 4 is where I'd say that the game begins to fall off. All of the levels before this were at the very least passable, if not a little aimless, but that's just how the game is. But in the abandoned warehouses, it becomes problematically bad, to the point where it's actually noticeable. Regardless, though, I've already rambled on for long enough about how this level is just aggravating to play, so I'm just gonna skip ahead to when we finally confront the guy we've been looking for this entire time. Steve here spouts some lines akin to the writing of fucking anonymous agony, and he casts the guy in a fit of rage. After that, though, feeling that his brother is still not avenged, he decides to go on a rampage and kill as much of the city's criminal underworld as possible. Not right now, that's what he plans on doing. Surprisingly, the accomplice is pretty okay with this, and after they extract from the docks, we can head back to the safe house and discuss our new battle plan. Now that we've avenged our brother, our sights can be fixed on the city's network of organized crime, starting off with that old shopkeeper fellow. Since we don't actually know where he's hiding, our first stop is a drug lab that is said to be in his turf. The entire point is just to try and find some data on this guy so we can maybe find his possible location. The mission itself plays decently, but right now, after the abandoned warehouses, anything is gonna seem better. By this point, 𝘸𝘢𝘴𝘩 is also a little more willing to just go loud if the occasion called, since after trial and error stealthing my way through the abandoned warehouses, I was pretty much completely demoralized. That, and this is also the level that features the 𝘐𝘥𝘪𝘰𝘵 combat shotgun, and for reasons I've already shown, this gun is absolutely insane. In the end, though, we do end up finding an office with a laptop that'll give us the info that we've been looking for. From what it seems, apparently this shopkeeper guy is going to be receiving a batch of coke from the goons here sometime soon, and using the data from the message we can find out where he's actually hiding. The place he's hiding just so happens to be an enormous, lavish mansion guarded by at least 50 goons. This is another level that I really don't actually mind. Then again, I had dropped the whole stealth aspect of the game in favor of just going in like a maniac and killing everyone. Well, I did try to go in with stealth. Ambush tactics are still the way to go, and packing a silenced pistol is always going to be a nice choice. Anyways, though, this level does have some pretty cool parts. There's a decently sized hedge maze full of shotgun-wielding goons. The mansion itself is pretty expansive, with the shopkeeper having a literal money room only accessible by keycard. And generally, on the whole, the level looks pretty nice. Oh, and speaking of the shopkeeper himself, when we find him he's an asshole, as expected, even trying to pull a gun on us. However, he does tell us that the person who's been ordering these drugs goes by the moniker of the baker, but he also refuses to elaborate any further. So once we end up capping the guy, we seem to be at a bit of a dead end. We do have a possible culprit, but without any info, the accomplice can't really do a whole lot. Steve, on the other hand, assuming that what the shopkeeper said about us being public enemy number 1 is a plain fact, thinks that we'll be able to lure out a bunch of his goons and ask them about the baker's whereabouts. Peacefully. With guns. But that's besides the point. It's not necessarily the greatest plan, but it's what we've got. So, Steve heads out to an abandoned complex to enact his plan. And sure enough, a group of armed goons 22 strong rolls up in hopes of killing him. The entire goal of this mission is just to fucking kill everyone. This is honestly just one of my favorite maps in the game because of that. Once we whack the last goon, though, we can talk with the accomplice. Understandably, the goons weren't exactly willing to talk, so instead, Steve manages to pilfer a phone from one of their corpses to give to the accomplice. The phone does have some pretty juicy stuff. Most important of which being the location of the elusive Baker character. Apparently the guy we took the phone from just had his home base marked as home on the navigational app, which makes our job much easier. That home just so happens to be another warehouse on the edge of town, owned by One Luxus Incorporated, and this is our next level. This is the first of 2 maps that happen to be split up in 2 parts. This first one is split up between the main warehouses as part 1, and Baker's Panic Room in part 2. At this point I had all but dropped the stealth act in favor of just planning like I was the ATF going into the dog pound. I mean, I just killed everybody in this level. I mean, I still brought a silenced pistol, but that was more force of habit at this point. In the end, though, after brute forcing my way through Baker's defenses, we can finally confront the man himself in his panic room. Considering the circumstances, he's pretty relaxed and also kind of chill with us. According to him, he was only doing this whole drug-dealing, kingpin business shit because there was a market for it, and the people seemed to want it. He claims that even if Steve does kill him right there and then, there will be another one like him in his place not too far after he's gone. Whatever the case may be, we're given the choice of either sparing the baker or killing him. As far as I know, this is the only time in the game that you're given any other options in dialogue. And so to flex my new creative freedom, I decided to spare him myself. While Steve doesn't trust him, he does give us his phone number, claiming that it may be of some use later on. In the end, we have to lie to the accomplice about killing Baker, and he thanks us for our services in ridding the scum from the city. After that, though, Steve returns to his actual house to call it a day and finally relax after a job well done. But of course, things can't go well, and some hired goons break in and we have to take them out. Man, I swear every safe house in gaming must run off the same rules as Chekhov's gun. If a place is shown in the first act as a safe area, then it'll be used as a combat encounter in the second act. Steve, of course, is unsurprisingly victorious against the armed goons. Surprisingly, one of them isn't dead, and Steve starts to interrogate the guy. The guy doesn't know who actually ordered the hit, as he was just offered the job by some guy named Empathetic, who is apparently in charge of dealing all of the hits out in this city. After Steve Old Yeller is the last of the hired guns, he realizes that his house isn't safe anymore, so he decides to call up Baker to set a meeting. When we meet Baker, he's moved from a lavish mansion to a smaller, more secluded safe house location. Steve calls it a shithole, but it's still actually decently nice. While Steve went into this thinking that it was definitely Baker who called the hit on him, Baker is still adamant that he wasn't the one that called the hit. And when we tell him that the dying hitman mentioned something about Empathetic, he's not at all surprised. He gives us the offer of supplying us with, once again, anything we need. More guns, ammo, and a new safe house away from prying eyes. Steve is rightfully skeptical of this offer, but the Baker claims that it's a favor for letting him live, even though he had indirectly caused his brother's death. After this point, Baker stops becoming a relevant force in the story, and our next hit is Empathetic's joint, which happens to be a very lavish restaurant. Before Steve can leave, though, he hears voices outside his house and gets ready for a fight. Instead of there being another team of highly trained hitmen outside, though, it's just a group of incompetent thugs. Apparently, over the span of the last 3 days, whoever ordered the failed hit on us has put another bounty on our head, which happens to be a nice, juicy sum of $10 million fucking dollars. Steve at this point has also garnered a certain level of mimetic infamy in the wake of the failed raid. Now everybody has heard the story of this random guy who managed to wipe the floor with a group of highly trained hitmen. And everyone just starts acting like Steve is fucking John Wick or something. Anyways, once the goons are down, by either their own hands or our hands, we can head over to Empathetic's restaurant, and this is our second 2-part map. It's also probably one of my least favorite levels in the game. I don't know why, but this level just turned my brain into mush. I mean, I had to play it more times than I can count on both hands and feet. The end of the level may only show that I died 10 times, but I reloaded many quick saves, and I just restarted the entire mission at least 1 or 2 times. So only 10 is a bit of a wild underestimate. Anyways, when we finally wipe out all of Empathetic's goons, we can confront the man himself on the second floor of his restaurant. However, we're flanked by 2 goons, so killing him really isn't an option. All things considered though, this empathetic guy is surprisingly chill with us, telling us that it wasn't a personal thing that he happened to have with Steve, it's just that the lump sum of money that he was paid was simply too vast to turn down. In the end, he can't give us the name of the person who ordered the hit, but he can put us in contact with someone who does. That person being another gang member who happens to go by the alias of the Mole. He tells us that he does know who called in the hit, but in exchange for the information, he wants us to do him a favor. That favor being to kill his boss, who runs a whole combination casino club. Only the classiest of establishments for this man. At this point, I had gotten immensely burned out of this fucking game, so I had all but given up on stealth. I know that's like the 3rd time I've said that, but now I really mean it. I mean, this time I didn't even pack a silenced pistol to start with, I just burst in guns blazing. I'm just gonna skip past pretty much this entire map though, since the level isn't back-ended by a conversation with our target. Anyways, once we return to the safe house, Steve contacts the Mole and tells him that the deed is done. And the Mole, true to his word, gives us the identity of the whistleblower who called in the hit, only for it to, of course, end up being the accomplice. I mean, it really couldn't have been anyone else. Sure, Baker was kind of sketch, but from the get-go the accomplice guy just seemed way too willing to help us out. In hindsight, this was obviously so that he could have us wipe out all of his opponents, which would make him the #1 head honcho in the city. Anyways, Steve loses it, hangs up the phone, and just storms out of his house bound for the accomplice's compound, which he somehow knows the location of. This compound effectively forces you into combat. I mean, the entire goal of the level, regardless of whether you didn't kill anyone across the rest of the game, is just to kill everyone. While that was the goal of killing all of the people back in the abandoned complex, this level is significantly larger and has twice the amount of enemies in it. Normally when stealth games do this, it ruins the entire ending of the game. Instead of the game giving you one last test of your stealth skills, it just funnels you into a combat gauntlet in the 11th hour. But for me, this game really hasn't been about stealth. It's been about guns, and killing lots of people. When the last man falls, we can finally confront the man himself in his office. He pleads for his life, as expected, and Steve just starts serving up the juiciest one-liner ham you can imagine. But in the end, he sends the accomplice to the big drug lab in the sky. After that, we get an ending monologue where he reflects on his choices thus far, and what has taken him to this point. For all of you pacifists out there, the game will even change one line of his ending speech to reward you. Regardless, he's down to just quit this life for good. Maybe he'll go and hit up that girl he met in the bar that one night. It's been forever, but it's worth a shot. He does also contemplate not hanging up the mask, though, saying that it would be a good idea to keep the pressure up on the crackheads throughout the city, to prevent something like this from happening again. So that was certainly quite the adventure. On the whole, it was a decent enough ride, but man, there were just some strange choices on the behalf of the developers. The lack of voice acting definitely burns the most when you start to analyze this game's story, since without it, some lines can just seem unhinged. Some of the things that Steve utters over the course of the game sound like it was something I'd say to mock my friends in like fucking 7th grade. Yeah, you're free to go. To hell. I mean, what? Without any voice acting, it's hard to tell if it's supposed to be played straight or played as a joke. I personally like to think that this is just comedic conjecture to give the game some more character, but even then, just, man, it is a strange choice. Anyways, Steve's story is over. At least for now. In reality, a sequel is already in development. Well, actually, it's probably more accurate to say that it's out of development now, since at the time of writing this, the sequel is set to release on the 19th of January. From what I've heard and the little bit of gameplay that I've seen so far, the game looks like it's addressed most of the gameplay issues that I mentioned in the video, which is certainly a good sign. Anyways, if you feel like any of this has sounded remotely interesting to you, then I'll link the game's GOG page down in the description. I know I usually link the game's Steam page in the description, but on GOG it's $5 cheaper, and for 15 bucks I can say that it's easily worth the price. Even then, I'm sure the game will go on sale once the sequel releases, so if you'd want to pick this game up, that would also be a good time to do so. Anyways, that's all from me. Tune in next time when I play a game that I actually really like.